All right, well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. New York Climate Week, day 3, and we're here at the Nature Positive Hub. And we'll be addressing the really important subject of how nature can foster equity when it comes to adapting to extreme heat. We are going to be zooming in on extreme heat in our conversation, so we'll probably go beyond when we talk about different hazards. But we're zooming in on extreme heat to start the conversation, and we're also going to be zooming in on equity. Because I think this heat, what I'm going to call the heat nexus, HEAT, H for heat or hazard, E for equity, A for adaptation, and T, as we're talking about extreme heat risk, I'm going to use T for trees, but also for nature. And I want to explore in the conversations that our speakers, our wonderful speaker, we have some really amazing brain power here in the room today. I want them to think about this heat nexus, right? How do these four aspects combine in addressing the challenge of adapting to the climate crisis and biodiversity crisis? How does heat or the hazard combine or contribute to addressing the issues of equity through or in adaptation and through nature, right? Nature-based approaches to adaptation. We'll be talking about that a lot as well. I'm Daniel Morchain. I'm the Global Director of the Climate Adaptation Team at the Nature Conservancy. Really thrilled to be here. I'll introduce our lineup, roster, which is really, I just can't believe we have this roster, and you'll be pleased for that, to hear that pretty soon. But I wanted to say a few more things in framing the subject. We talk extreme heat, and we normally think of the temperature, right? Temperature going up, and that's the challenge. It's hotter, 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 and of course that is part of the challenge. But there's another element to the challenge at hand, which is not the heat itself, but is the socioeconomic factors upon which that heat manifests. So, for example, in places with the higher levels of income inequality or poverty, then that heat or that increasing heat, increasing temperature is going to be more dangerous, make people more vulnerable and put them more at risk than in other places where we don't have socioeconomic factors that include poverty, inequality. So let's think along those lines, right? And consider the biophysical hazard, but the socioeconomic conditions where this happens. And I know that all our speakers are really thinking deeply about these issues. Let me put just two facts on the table, and I know it's just two facts that there's so many more to share, but just to put us in the right place in my mind. Every 1 degree Fahrenheit, the temperature goes up. That means that there is a 2.5% increased risk of heat mortality. And put that in the context of the next fact, which is that in the United States, 15% or there is 15% less tree cover in low-income neighborhoods than there is in high-income neighborhoods, and also a 3-degree Fahrenheit difference as a result of this. So connect that to the first one, and you see the vulnerability really gets compounded massively when it comes to, in this case, tree inequality. Vulnerability, then, of course, what I'm trying to say is created by this compounded biophysical hazard and socioeconomic part. And bottom line, nature-based solutions or nature-based approaches to adaptation really have to address both. If they only address the biophysical hazard, then what I propose here for the discussion is then that nature-based solution is incomplete, is inappropriate, is really ineffective, and I'd even say has a risk of making people worse off, people who are already exposed and vulnerable to climate impacts. So in that sense, let's think of the heat nexus when we're thinking about what are the right nature-based approaches moving forward. The Nature Conservancy is committed to 4 principles in the way that we're approaching adaptation work. The first one is to put people and equity at the center of all these efforts. The second one is about integrating different types of knowledge in framing the solution and the way forward. So not just natural sciences, but also social sciences, indigenous local knowledge, really bring all of this together without a preset or a predetermined hierarchy to define and develop, the way forward. You can, if you just use one of those knowledges in the way forward, then you're missing part of the challenge, right? The third principle is around nature positive. So the work that we do also has positive impacts to the natural environment or ecosystems. And we are also dedicated to investing in the capacities and leadership skills of local partners in the way that we are working, so that, of course, there is, well, that's fair, that's right. There's also important longevity elements to that, or longevity benefits to working and investing in local partners. So we're in a journey to get there. And just to wrap it up, I wanted to share some initial reflections of how that journey is shaping up, and things that we're thinking about in, applying these 4 principles in our day-to-day work. And one is around the importance of building trust and long-term associations with our local partners. Without that, I really claim again, that we're failing the mission, and we are not doing enough. We're not framing the problem in the right way. The second one is around responding and redressing to historical systemic injustices. I think this is essential in the way that we engage in the climate crisis. Not bringing this into the fore of our framing and thinking of solutions for the problem really would make it, would not make the solution neither long-lived nor relevant for communities and for people that we're trying to partner up with. And the third and final one is recognizing the difference of relationship of people and environment. There's not a single relationship how people connect or cultures connect to the environment. And we need to recognize this, understand this, so that then the propositions of how to move ahead or how to move forward, how to use nature as part of the responses to the climate change challenge, then are the right ones. So recognizing this diversity of engagement and relationship with nature. So what we'll do today is first have a conversation between the slide there. Hopefully it'll move. There it is. All right. Between fantastic panelists that we have here, Chair Brenda Mallory, Chair of the Council of Environmental Quality at the White House. Thank you so much, Chair Mallory, for being here. We're honored. We're thrilled for that. So Chair Brenda Mallory and our Chief Scientist at the Nature Conservancy, Catherine Hayhoe, also will be, she's here. So thanks again, Catherine, also for being here. And they'll have a conversation about these topics. What is in their minds? And there's a lot. We'll start with that, and then we're going to have a panel with 3 fabulous speakers as well. But I'll introduce them later, and that'll be probably a wrap. We'll have time, of course, after the panel to have a conversation here in the room. So with that, over to you, Chair Brenda Mallory. Over to you, Catherine. Have a great conversation. Thank you.
Yes. Well, thank you everyone for coming, and everyone who's listening online. This will be recorded as well as being live streamed, so it's available afterwards. And I have to say, this is an enormous treat and a privilege, because we're just going to have a conversation and you all get to listen. You also get a bit of a chance to comment too at the end. But with Climate Week, there's so much running around and there's so much listening to panels that just to get the chance to sit down and converse for some amount of time is a luxury. And it's really a time to go a little bit deeper on some of these issues. So I'm a climate scientist. Yes, as you know, and everybody else probably knows too. And I know that climate change affects everyone. Every living thing on this planet almost is experiencing the impacts of climate change. And 2 years ago, a study showed that 85% of humans on the planet had personally been affected by climate change. Today, 2 years later, I think that number is nearing 100. But I also know that climate change does not affect everyone equally. Climate change disproportionately affects poor and marginalized societies. People who already don't have a safe place to live, or clean water that comes out of the tap, or enough food to feed their children, or access to very basic education or healthcare, are most impacted by climate change. And that is not only true in places like sub-Saharan Africa, it's also true right in some of our biggest cities here in the United States today. So I want to begin by asking you, what is one of the biggest ways that you see climate change and our loss of nature and biodiversity disproportionately affecting people here?
Well, first of all, thank you. It is an honor to actually be here. You're happy to have me here. I'm very happy to be invited to be here. This is a really great opportunity to actually talk about some of the great work that we're doing in the administration, but also with people who I think of as really important partners. One of the things that I think is abundantly clear, if you're paying attention at all to President Biden and Vice President Harris's agenda, is that focusing on equity and trying to address the disproportionate impacts that we know what's the right word, land on certain people is very central to that. And I think what we've seen in looking at climate change and what we need to do to solve it is that across the board, whether it's heat or flooding or any of the impacts that have become to be known as part of the climate crisis, they're affecting communities who are already burdened to a much greater extent. That has a lot to do with where people live. I mean, it is no accident that people who are being flooded are living in communities that were forced into those areas in a lot of cases. Redlining is very much a reality that still is impacting where people live today. What that means is that you have people who are poorer, as you said, who don't have the resources to actually bounce back from some of the impacts that they're experiencing as easily being repeatedly affected by these issues. And so I think that the focus on heat in particular, as we know, one of the impacts that probably harms people to the greatest extent, more than flooding, more than some of the other climate impacts, more people kind of die from heat impacts. And we think we don't even really fully understand that number well enough, just because we're not really counting it in that way. And so I think we have been focused on trying to address those issues. Last week, I was in Iowa with Secretary Vilsack, who was announcing $1 billion grant that we're giving that is allowing for tree canopy and trees to be planted in urban areas. It's specifically targeting communities that have been identified under the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool as priorities. All 385 of those grants that are going to be given actually are going to people who are suffering from a disproportionate impacts and from heat.
Can I ask a quick question? Is that part of the IRA funding or is that something else?
Yes, this is definitely IRA funding, but the combination of IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law, like those are working really hand in hand on a lot of the work that we're doing across the administration. And so that was a great example of really seeing us being able to put the focus on equity and this particular issue together.
All right. That is phenomenal to know that solutions are happening today, because I speak with people all across the country and all around the world. And the biggest question I get from people today is, what can we do? And having real examples of things that are already happening can be game changing. So people realize it's not a future issue. We're already addressing it today. So let's turn to talking about the solutions that you already began to allude to, the way that nature can play into these solutions. So we're confronting the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. We depend on nature. Nature doesn't need us, we need nature. Every other breath we take comes from oxygen generated by phytoplankton in the ocean. Trees and nature in our cities provide flood control, like you mentioned. They filter our air from air pollution, which is responsible for millions of premature deaths around the world every year, and over 200,000 in the US alone. And then they reduce the heat, which reduces the urban heat island effect and protects us during heat waves. And as you said, extreme heat is also a killer that we haven't even fully quantified, because what it does is it shuts down your body. And so they write on the certificate of death, died of heart or breathing or whatever, but it was triggered by heat. So it's really hard to track. So nature is a huge part of the solution. When it comes to climate change, a third of the carbon emissions we produce per year could be taken up by nature through 2030 through restoring, protecting, and investing in nature, including green infrastructure, as well as protecting the Amazon and coastal ecosystems. When it comes to biodiversity loss, obviously conserving, restoring, protecting nature, not just in remote places, but in and near our cities and our fields and our farms is also part of the biodiversity crisis. Just think about the pollinator crisis. It's related to farming into areas that are near, not far. But in the past, in the distant past, there are examples of, and even still today, there are some examples of using nature to address the climate and biodiversity crisis at the expense of people. Solutions like protecting a unique and important biodiverse area of land at the expense of the people who live there, who are often very low income rural communities or sometimes even indigenous peoples. And so there's been this sense of, net zero sum game where either we do this or we do this, but we can't do both. And I think one of the biggest changes we've seen in this area in the last 10 years is we realize we can do both. There are nature-based solutions that address biodiversity, climate, and they address equity and health. So you started to mention one. Can you elaborate a little bit on how does nature help with our cities?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I actually, again, I think it picks up on a point that I think of as being central in this administration, which is the focus on people and trying to break down what I think has been a historic understanding that when we talk about the environment, that we're just talking about protecting the environment for the environment's sake, as if it were separate from people. And that's not how we're thinking of. That's not how we talk about it. And I think, sort of some examples, like, so first of all, just to note, the administration has $50 billion, which is also IRA money that is dedicated to sort of thinking about resilience. Resilience sort of presents itself in work that's being done in restoration in coastal areas, where we know coastal areas are so important, not only for the people who live there, but also for what they do to the economy. When we think about the way in which the ocean and the coastal areas actually affect our economic impact, that's really important. When we think about it culturally, I mean, people all the time talk about how important the coast have been and the traditions that have developed, not only for Native Americans, but African Americans. Like, that's a really big part of what history has been important. So like the restoration in those areas, and done in a way that actually recognizes what is of value to those people, I think is central to sort of what we're trying to do. So that's the kind of work that we're doing. What's important about it is making sure that as we are thinking about how to restore, that we are bringing the communities in central to that conversation, what that looks like, translating that language so that we can actually make sure we're doing it correctly.
And then also asking them what they need too, right?
Right.
Because all too often people have ideas of what other people need, but they aren't necessarily what they actually need.
Yeah.
And in some cases, it could be the opposite of what they need.
Right.
So you've mentioned a few different solutions. And for those of you who are wondering, well, how exactly does that work? So let me give you a couple of concrete examples of ways that with the Nature Conservancy, we work in 82 countries around the world, as well as every state in the United States. So implementing these solutions here in the US, as well as in other countries around the world, a lot of this is transferable and scalable. So we can invest here where we have the monitoring, the data, the infrastructure, support from IRA or other federal programs, and then look at other countries and say, well, they don't have, the support or the technical knowledge or the data, but because of what we've learned here, we can apply it. So you mentioned coasts. Sea levels rising, storm surges are getting stronger, tropical storms, including hurricanes, cyclones, and typhoons, same storm, they just call them different names depending on where they are in the world. They're getting stronger because they're being powered by warmer ocean water. Because 89% of the extra heat that's being trapped inside our climate system by this blanket of heat trapping gases we're wrapping around the planet is going into the ocean. So how do we protect our coastlines, which, as you say, are so important? 70 million people around the world, 700 million people around the world live in low-lying coastal areas. The United Nations estimates that almost half the population of the world depends on the ocean as their primary source of protein. And many of those are low-income communities. Coral reefs protect 25% of the ocean's biodiversity, and they're increasingly being bleached by heat waves. How do we protect the ocean and our coastlines? Restoring coastal wetlands is a huge part of doing that. It's an important ecosystem. It decreases storm surges. It buffers from sea level rise. Mangrove forests along the coast provide an ecosystem for fishing. They provide wood. Often women have to go collect the wood, and having that wood easily available makes a big difference in their lives. And then mangroves protect, and they actually dampen storm surge significantly. So that's one concrete way that nature can help. Then in cities, Danielle alluded to the fact that low-income neighborhoods in many US cities and cities around the world, not just in the US, can be about 3 degrees Celsius on average warmer, but during a heat wave, they can be 7 or 8 degrees Celsius warmer. That's about 15 degrees Fahrenheit warmer during a heat wave. And what does that mean? It has huge impacts on people's health, on their air conditioning bills, on their ability to stay cool. It even affects our tempers. We'd get edgy when things get hot. So when we green low-income neighborhoods, it cools them down, but it doesn't just do that. I want you to actually count this with me. So number one, it cools them down, which protects people's health and their pocketbooks during heat waves. Green space also provides a place for water to go when it rains. And like you just said, a lot of low-income neighborhoods due to redlining are located in flood zones. That's number two, takes up water. Number three, we know that spending time in nature, even 15 minutes in nature, actually changes the physical chemistry of your body. The impacts of nature on human health, we are just starting to see the tip of the iceberg, I feel like, in terms of how important it is for us as humans to be in nature. That's number three. Then air pollution. I mentioned earlier how air pollution, especially from burning fossil fuels, is a significant source of illness and even death here in the US as well as around the world. And guess what? Greenery, trees filter the air. So what are we at now? Who's counting? Is that 4? Okay, thank you. We got 4 right here in the front row. Oh, and then by the way, of course, all those growing things take up carbon, right? So that's almost like the icing on the cake. And then having those green spaces and having those recreational opportunities can also help improve the neighborhood, offering people opportunities to spend some time outside, to be in community. You can also engage with community gardens and programs like that, having events for kids outside. So there's all these win-win-win-wins that when I look at them, I mean, I'm a scientist, so I just look at these and I think, well, you add it all up and it's equal, the sum is equal to greater than the whole is equal to greater than some of the parts. Why aren't we doing more of this? How do you see it?
Well, I mean, I think everything you just said is true. And I do feel like what we have tried to do in the administration now is really to kind of focus on some of those key points. So like, as you talked about, like the need to have, well, first of all, let me just say, we have long-term and we have short-term things that we have to address. So on the short term, like the fact that people are boiling in their apartments now is something we have to face today. And so one of the programs that we have is called LIHEAP. I'm not going to be able to tell you what those letters stand for right now, but it's a program that allows us actually to provide funding to people to help them with their air conditioning. Sometimes it's like to borrow air conditioning. Sometimes it's just to actually help them pay their bills. So like that's one thing where we're trying to deal with the sort of the short-term impacts. The idea that that food security or food insecurity is very much impacted by some of the climate impacts that we're feeling is also really significant. And I think we have used some of the funding that we're getting to actually help people who are working to bring more farming areas within urban areas, like the small urban farms is important. I think that the other thing that the administration is also very focused on, as we already talked about the trees, which have all the benefits that you just said, but also a recognition that what we're doing on some of the climate impacts are just helping people in general have better health, right? Like that health connection has proven to be something that we are very focused on. There are, we have a couple of different what I call government organized mechanisms, that we're working on a strat. There's a White House interagency group that is focused on heat in particular. And this is in part to take advantage of the idea of a whole of government approach to addressing all of these issues. So it's with each agency bringing the power of their mission and resources to try to make sure that we're doing as much as we can to focus on some of those issues. So that's an important component. We're in the process right now of working on what's going to be a resilience framework that it will be released, I think next week. And the point of that, again, is to try to pull the full force of the federal government together as we are trying to make sure that every agency is bringing to the table the benefits of their programs and what can be offered, either through the funding that exists between, with IRA or with their own funding that already existed.
So based on that, I feel like, and you probably feel like, and probably everyone in this room feels like, there's never enough. You always wish that there was more time, more support, more effort, more collaboration, more knowledge. If you could wave a magic wand and just get more something that's within the realm of physical possibility, no magic, But, if you could just make something happen in terms of having something available to you that would really accelerate and scale what you're doing, what would that be?
That's a great question. I think a couple things I'll say about that. Number one is having the mechanisms to help communities with the capacity issues that they're trying to deal with, right? Like that's real. That's real. Like, in fact, even as we have have more funding and we are going to communities ready to offer various resources, the communities aren't always positioned to be able to receive that, right? And so there are like various technical assistance grants that agencies like EPA have, even that go beyond their programs, that are designed to try to help people figure out how to manage the grant system. So I think that's really important to continue, because otherwise we have these potential benefits that people are not going to be able to access. It's also really important to be able to increase those mechanisms where we're hearing from folks directly, right? One of the things that I think that, we're just, as we're having conversations with various communities and different workshops, like as you're thinking about these great ideas, like, planting more trees, we're also hearing why you're getting some resistance sometimes from communities, or reticence from communities, right? Because they're worried about the liability that might be associated with those trees, like either because everyone now, well, not everyone, but people associate trees with being part of the damage that's caused when you have one of these extreme weather events. Trees fall, they fall in your cars, they fall in your house, they create problems. The other thing is that you can't just plant trees, you've got to maintain trees, right? And so the money that we're offering is for that, but is it really geared in the way that's really essential? Because one of the problems that we've heard in a couple of places is about the cost of water. Like trees have to be watered if you're planting, new trees in areas, and they have to be watered. So again, being able to make sure that the dollars are able to deal with these very specific and unique kinds of problems, I think is important. Sometimes we have money for one thing and we really need money for another thing. And that's why the increasing the way in which we can have communication with communities about what really some of the issues are that they're dealing with on the ground is really important.
I'm glad to hear you mention that, because that is something that I see in real life. So I live in the state of Texas, which is the most vulnerable state in the whole US to climate impacts, because we get the most of them. We get everything. We get wildfires. You don't hear about that, but we do get them in Texas. Of course, we get the floods, the hurricanes. We get ice storms and snowstorms, of course, and knock out the power grid. Yeah, I know. And always, it's the lower income communities that lose the power for the longest, or are flooded, who have the greatest heat, or who have the switch turned back on the last. And then in the recovery process, what you just mentioned about capacity, in Texas, as of the last decade, more than 50% of homeowners are Hispanic. And so there's often language barriers where you can't access the information because it's not in your native language. You're not literate in that language. And there's a lot of government forms to fill out sometimes. And it's just hard to even get that information. So you could provide all the best information in the world, and you could provide even all the money in the world. But if people don't know how to access it, then it isn't going to reach them. And that's the community capacity, or at least part of it, that you were mentioning.
No, I think that's exactly right. And I think one of the things that just at the beginning of the administration, when again we came in, we didn't even have all the money yet, and we're dealing with the extreme weather events at the beginning, and visiting communities, and they would describe what they were dealing with: flooding in their neighborhoods, it's in their basement, they can't get there, and then they have these FEMA forms that they can't fill out because, first of all, they can't get to the information because it's in the basement that was flooded, that's no longer reachable. And so there is some effort has been made to try to address some of that, but I think there's a lot of work left in those areas, right? Like trying to turn the federal government into a system that is actually can be more responsive to those kinds of problems. That's a work in progress. We still need that. Like if we think about things that we need to improve on, that's a place where we still need to improve for sure.
Well, so I couldn't agree more. And I was really excited because Housing and Urban Development actually just funded us at Texas Tech University, which is where I'm also a faculty member, to set up a new center of excellence for climate resilient housing. And so that's exactly what we want to focus on, using Texas as a case study, because I really feel like if you can address a problem in Texas, you can often address it anywhere. So Texas is really a great sort of lab for that type of thing. So we just have a couple of minutes left. And so let's open it up. Does anybody have a question or a thought? Yes, go ahead. And please identify yourself too. Thank you. Yes, because of the online. Yeah.
I'm Tanushri Biswas with TNC. I led the paper which talks about urban heat island and the impact on equity, tree cover and all. Uh, it was great from you to hear about the cost of maintaining the trees, but have you considered, because we have shown through data that we can plant trees in low-income neighborhoods to close the urban heat island gap, but the parallel impact is it eventually might lead to gentrification further because the property values go out and then the low income communities are pushed out. How are you thinking about that aspect so that by having this vision of supporting communities to advance climate solution and tree equity, we do not do unintended harm? Are you thinking about integrating?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think actually the issue of gentrification comes up all the time. Every time we're talking to people, I won't say we have a great solution for it at this moment, but it is one that I think people are very mindful of and trying to figure out how do we address that? Because it is true that if you look across the country right now, you know, property values are higher in places where there are trees. Right. That is true. And that's almost a way to distinguish some of your wealthier communities from others, just to look at the tree issue. So that is something that we know that we have to address. And can I also say, I didn't specifically mention the nature-based solutions report that we put out, I think a year ago. It was actually, I think, released at COP maybe, but released actually at one of the big conferences. And the point of that is actually to, again, help organize the government so that we are targeting the things across the government that we're spending our funding on, that we're helping to kind of build up the workforce in areas, and just making sure that, again, as a whole of government, that we're trying to address the opportunity that nature-based solutions present.
And I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's an example of how you have to consider the side effects of what you do. One other side effect that has to be considered is climate is changing faster than any time in human history. So if you are greening an urban area and you're planting trees that were native to that area 50 years ago, they're not going to be native now. And so in some places in Texas, there's companies who are like, oh, let's take all the employees out and plant trees. They'll be great, reduce the urban heat island effect. A year later, it's a stand of dead trees because they planted the wrong kind. So we really have to think very carefully. And that means that the adage that, you go fast if you go alone, you go, far if you go together. We really have to go together in terms of understanding all the different ramifications of the social, the economic, the scientific, the physical science, the ecological science, and all of those together to really look for lasting solutions to win, 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 because we don't have time for single wins and we have no time for solutions that make one thing better while making something else worse.
And I have to say, like, one of the things that comment in particular, like the level of change that's occurring is so great. And yet we really need to be very thoughtful about how we're going about this. Like, as somebody who's like trying to defend the National Environmental Policy Act and its importance in the work that we're doing, this is not the time to stop using that as the tool to try to figure out what are the best decisions, right? Because we know that the change that you just described is just one example of things that we need to anticipate where climate change is taking things in order to be sure that we're actually putting in solutions that matter.
It's a new paradigm, but I truly believe that the climate and the biodiversity crises, solving them is not our goal. Our goal is a better future. And by tackling these issues, I believe we can tackle issues of equity and justice and health at the same time. And I think we can be in a better place in the future through this. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Catherine Hayhoe, TNC Chief Scientist. Thank you so much, Brenda Mallory, Chair of the Council on Environmental Quality at the White House. I love your conversation and also how you wrapped it up. So let's go together to that better place, right? And a way to start getting there is, that's a bold statement there, but is through the panel that we will have right now. And that panel, I'd like to invite then Eva Olivas, the Executive Director of the Phoenix Revitalization Corporation, to join us here. Eva, very welcome. I'd like to invite Jad Daly, President and CEO of American Forests. Thanks, Jad, for being here. Thanks, Eva. and Paula Caballero, Regional Managing Director of Latin America for Latin America at the Nature Conservancy. So Paula, so very welcome. Thank you. So we are going to dedicate about half an hour to have a nice conversation here, trying to connect to all the points that Chair Mallory and Catherine brought up. And the overall umbrella questions for reference and for your thinking as well is, how can the conservation sector, and when I say sector, I mean it in the broadest sense possible, help most vulnerable communities adapt, right? That journey together with equity at the center. Can different interests of different actors be aligned, and somehow nature-based solutions be a way to make that alignment happen? Can it? And finally, can these multiple crises be resolved within the existing systems? Or what, in other words, what structural changes are needed to happen in order to enable the change that we want to see to go together to that better place? So, Eva, why don't we hear first your thoughts on particularly the focus of your organization. So your organization focuses on community development and prosperity. And within addressing that broad agenda, the aspect of trees and heat is something that you tackle and that has become quite central to your mission, as I understand it. So why trees and heat?
So first, I want to thank you everyone for being here today, and thank you for inviting me. I want to share that I'm a native Phoenician. Yes, fifth largest city in the country and 500 square miles. And if you haven't heard, it's been extremely hot in Phoenix, Arizona this year. We had over 100 days or 104 days with temperatures that were over 100. Of those 104, 54 of them were over 110. So I remember back when I was a child, being a native, I used to run to the park, and we would literally go barefoot. And we would just kind of hop from shade to shade before we got to the park, dip our feet in the little tiny creek that is gone and the trees that are gone. And today feels a lot different than when I was a child. So that is kind of Phoenix is where I was born and love it there. But there are challenges right now. About 13, 14 years ago, I was walking through my office and I read the news that morning and it said there were 8 heat-related deaths that day. It just stunned me. For some reason, that number just jumped out at me and I said, okay, well, what can I do? What can one person do to change this? So we launched a very simple Sizzling Safe Summer campaign, just to remind people that, look, if they told you it's hot here when you moved, it's hotter than that. If you are from Phoenix, Arizona, and a native from around here, it's hotter than it was when we were children. And that was a very simple campaign that we launched. We did it through doing a little community session. Don't forget, what does a heat stroke look like? Don't forget to take CPR first aid. Do wellness checks. That is a very big thing for our seniors in our town. So it was very, very intense, kind of going around. Specifically, we went to Boys and Girls Club. We went everywhere, every place anybody would listen to us, we went. And we did 25 or 30 presentations a year. And then we piggybacked them with some pool parties, to try and, promote, get cool. But you have to remember, cool water in a pool in the summer in Phoenix, Arizona is about 90 degrees. It's extremely hot. So we had early pool parties. Those were the kinds of things we thought we could do, is how can we just remind people, inform people, keep it on their brain that it's hot. So we launched that. Our agency, through our board of directors, has a very focused way of working with the community, and that is resident-driven processes. We will not partner with anybody that does not allow our residents to be part of the conversation. So with that, the Nature Conservancy approached us about doing a project in one of the HUD areas, the choice neighborhoods, and we had already established our resident leadership council there. And that's how we became involved with producing the Nature's Cooling System plan for Edison Eastlake. But the one thing that you have to know is we're not scientists. We are just in most cases, we're a very small nonprofit. We have a whole 8 employees, very proud of them. 2 of them are here with me today. Thank you. Um, so we're not scientists. This type of knowledge is something that we don't have as small nonprofits who are trying to improve the conditions in the area. So how valuable it was to be connected to scientists. We were in awe of just being in the same room. And so can you imagine our residents who in the areas that we work in was the birth of public housing in the city of Phoenix. All the redlining that occurred in other cities happened, and even more shameful in our city. So there were many times that were so frustrating because we don't understand what they're saying. And if we don't get it, I know residents don't get it. And again, our role is how do we help residents react and respond and change things that are happening in their neighborhood. So we needed to get that information that you provide, you scientists are great people, into English, English, or Spanish, so that our residents could get it, absorb it, and then do something about it. So thankfully, the Nature Conservancy came in with a program that allowed us to be part of the development committee that included our residents, that included us. And we didn't ask a question until after we completed learning sessions. We needed them to understand what the ask was. And so that's kind of how we got started in this project. One of the other things I have to say is that we always feel, and we've been having this conversation, and we're starting our own program at our GAIN event, Getting Arizona Involved in Neighborhoods, is that it feels like we're always reacting to the heat in the middle of the heat instead of addressing this all year. I mean, when you understand that our summers start in the middle of April, beginning of April sometimes, they don't end till we're still at 100 degrees out in Phoenix today. So why are we trying to address this when we're in the middle of the heat? Why are we not working at this heavily? So we're very grateful that the city of Phoenix established the Office of Sustainability. I believe it was the first one in the country. So we're very excited. So that's kind of who we are.
Thanks so much, Eva. That makes a lot of sense. And I want to say on the point about the science and the knowledge, that also, that idea that connecting, integrating knowledge from natural scientists, social scientists, communities, really into mixing it into the right mix for the solution. That's key. So I would say the science also and the knowledge that you through your organization bring together and provide, that is an essential element of the whole package that needs to come together to produce the right path forward. So thanks for sharing that. And Jad, I'd love to hear from you actually something similar. Why has the American Forest Organization focused also so much of their efforts on tree equity?
Great, thanks. Well, I do want to do a couple quick thank yous. Thank you to TNC for, first of all, inviting me to join, but also for your leadership on this issue, and including working with great community-based organizations. It's just been amazing to see that, the world's largest and preeminent conservation organization take on this challenge. And so I'm just honored to join this great gathering today. It's also great to have our quarterback for climate justice in America, Chair Mallory, here. She's got a full dance card every day. And so the fact that you made the time to be here really means a lot. Thank you so much. That last piece should have been on the main stage at Madison Square Garden from my take. But listen, I want to keep it simple. You've heard so much good information today. And by the way, thanks to all of you for being here. I think this room would have been full if we'd done this in July when we were in the middle of the hottest summer on record. We need to remind people heat is a 12-month-a-year thing. We can't let the memory fade. But thank you all for keeping it in your hearts and being here. So I want to just try to cut through some amazing things we've heard and just make sure we're anchoring on some points. A map of trees is a map of income and is a map of race in every city in America and around the world. That's just a simple fact. And we can prove it. We created something called Tree Equity Score. We mapped every urban neighborhood in America using a standardized approach. And so you can see it, national averages. The lowest income neighborhoods in America have on average 29% less tree cover and are on average 7 degrees Fahrenheit hotter. The neighborhoods with the highest concentration of people of color in America, regardless of income, have 38% less tree cover and are 10 degrees Fahrenheit hotter. And that's on average. As you heard Catherine say, in some situations, it's way higher than that. This is a life or death difference. 102 becomes 112. If you live in a home without air conditioning, That means, and you live in an urban heat island where it doesn't cool down at night, that heat keeps radiating, you literally cooked in your home. So this is the leading edge of climate justice. As Chair Mallory said, extreme heat kills more people per year than any other type of extreme weather. It's the leading and most broadly shared threat from climate change. Now, we heard it's hard to quantify the risk of life and death from extreme heat. Let me put some numbers. Duke University gave it a shot to try to capture that undercounting. They found over 12,000 deaths per year in the United States from extreme heat. Their projections say by the end of this century, that's going to be 100,000 deaths per year from extreme heat if we don't do anything. Now, I'll give you all a poll question. How many of you think those extreme heat deaths are going to be concentrated in the neighborhoods where it's 10 to 20 degrees hotter, right? And where people have fewer defenses? I think everyone's hands going up on that. So this is, again, this is a leading edge of climate injustice. And that's why our organization is the oldest forest conservation organization in America, founded in 1875. I'm really proud that we've been working on urban trees from the very beginning. But trying to now, over the last 5 years, really refocus our work for what are the unique imperatives that climate change creates, and putting social equity and racial equity front and center in how we think about our work, and putting those two things together. We feel as though tree equity is the leading edge challenge that we need to confront together. And the last thing I'll say about this is, so that's, to me, the first, second, and third most important reason to do this. This is a frontline defense against extreme heat, and as you heard, against other health threats as well, right? Heat cooks air pollution, and so that role that trees play in both filtering air pollution and reducing heat creates other kinds of really important health benefits as well. But I want to reinforce two other benefits that were mentioned here. Trees in cities also help slow climate change in two important ways. Trees in our communities sequester in the US 129 million metric tons of carbon dioxide per year. That's more than 15% of the carbon sequestered in all the trees and forests in the United States is actually happening in our communities. Really surprises people. So it's a big component of reducing greenhouse gases. And nationally, trees in our cities and towns reduce home energy use for heating and cooling by more than 7%, saving homeowners more than $7 billion. And we know which homeowners most need those kinds of savings, right? It's in the neighborhoods where they least have trees today. But also that reduces energy use and, of course, reduces greenhouse gases associated with, for example, running air conditioners that in many cases we need, to keep people alive. So it's really, think about trees in cities as carbon negative cooling. And boy, do we need that if we're going to be able to bring equitable cooling to our cities at a scale that's going to address the climate justice imperative that I mentioned. So my closing thought is this. In case that wasn't enough, we haven't talked, I think, quite enough about the economic uplift opportunity. We did a study and found we can create 25.7 direct, indirect, and induced jobs for every $1 million that we invest in this work of urban forestry. And we are 110% committed to making sure that as we make, for example, an unprecedented, world-leading $1.5 billion investment through the Inflation Reduction Act in tree equity in cities. And thank you so much, Biden administration and our champions in Congress like Senator Booker and Senator Stabenow, who got that funding in place in the Inflation Reduction Act. As we make that investment, it is a moral imperative to ensure that that creates economic opportunity for people in the underserved neighborhoods where this work is taking place. That can't just be jobs for anyone. We have to make sure that this investment in restoring our communities is restoring economic opportunity for the people who needs it the most. And as we get into the discussion, I can give some really tangible examples how we're making that possibility very real by being intentional about it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chad. That's so overarching and so helpful to understand, and the couple of facts that I threw in the beginning, there's so much more that you have shared, that Eva shared, that our colleagues in the conversation shared before. And there's so much more that is being learned about this challenge and the impact that it's having. One word that Catherine mentioned before on the tempers, how it affects people's tempers, that kind of very hard to measure, but so important, not just from a productivity point of view, but just from a well-being point of view. So there's so much there that is yet to be understood better, but it's so nevertheless so important for our daily lives and well-being. So thanks for that. Paula, we've been talking a lot about the conversation. The conversation has been quite based on a US geographic scope, although we have touched a bit beyond. But so great to have you here to tell us a bit more about Latin America region, particularly. How is extreme heat affecting Latin America today? And if you want to take it broader on climate change, that's welcome too. But over to you, Paula.
Thank you. And it's great to join a panel of doers. This is, there we go. It's great to join a panel of doers and not announcers. Welcome Respite for Climate Week. So big shout out for that. Well done. Yeah, so a lot of what was said by Chair Mallory and others is obviously very relevant. Tree inequity, et cetera, in Latin America, which is one of, or the region with the greatest inequities in the whole world. So climate is a multiplier, and that's certainly an issue. But I did want to, in my second round of questions, I can drill more into some of the solutions, but to give you a bit of a context of why this matters. Latin America has experienced over the last 30 years an increase in about 0.6% Celsius. And that is for a region that is nature's powerhouse, that is highly dependent on agriculture and natural resources, hugely worrisome. That combination of increased temperatures, low humidity, and drought is a very potent and bad conjugation. So we're seeing an increase, for example, in 2 months in Argentina and Paraguay at the beginning of this year. Fire hotspots increased by 250% over the preceding 20 years. That is land that's going up in flames, and it's not just forests, it's also productive lands. We're talking about urban. Buenos Aires in August hit 86 degrees. That doesn't sound like very much when you're talking about 100 odd degrees. But mind you, August in Buenos Aires is in the middle of winter, right? It was the hottest climate records on record, and it was 10 degrees higher than the previous record, 10 degrees higher. So we're seeing not just the pace, but the extent of these increases in ways that exceed people, not people, community, societies, economies, capacity for coping ranges. The glaciers are melting. It's also happening very much in the Himalayas and other places, California. This has huge impacts for communities that have very low resilience and coping ranges. And we talk about things like urban. There was a study in Nature Medicine that calculated that between 2002 and 2015, 2015 was like before climate was happening, right? The prehistory. They calculated 900,000 urban deaths that were attributable to heat. And this is in the world's most urbanized region, which is Latin America. Chile is experiencing a 14-year mega drought. It's calculated to be the worst, not 100, in the last 1,000 years. So that's the reality of what we're facing. And I would just say that what happens in Latin America doesn't stay there. The Amazon is one of the great climate regulators of the world. It's getting closer to a tipping point. It's also becoming more of a source than a sink. So what we do there matters enormously. And Latin America produces about 1/4 of the world's food agricultural production. And that is only set to increase. So the pressures on Latin America, on our resources, not just land, but water, are going to increase. And if we can't step that up, it affects global food security. Let's look also at the fact that on average about, and some it varies, but let's say 50% of production is done by smallholders. And everything that we've been talking about here affects them in ways where you have less coping ranges, which means that they have in a risky business, which is smallholder agriculture, the risk is increased. You have less capacity, less collateral, less capacity for innovation, less capacity to generate investment for investment, and becomes a downward spiral where the structural inequities that we were all talking about earlier become a threat multiplier. So as I said, I'll go into solutions in the next round, but I want to leave you with this thought. We talk a lot about the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. The equity crisis is the third crisis. They're interlocked, they're interrelated. We have to address them together.
Thanks, Paula. I so agree with everything you said, and that final point around connecting these different crises. And I'll go back to the heat nexus, right? And talking about heat or the hazard, equity, the adaptation goals, and also what nature can do to help us get there, and what are the limitations of it. That's also the other key important question. So Let's go to the second round here. Eva, and you started speaking a little bit about the work that you're doing and some of the successes you've had. Here's a chance to go a little bit deeper, maybe into one of the projects or one of the initiatives that you feel are particularly relevant, maybe thinking about this heat nexus as well.
So I have to say that one of the things that really has stood out to me, sorry, is that this doesn't seem to be something that people look at the grassroots level. So because they're worried about how they're going to pay the bills, they're worried about how they're going to eat, how they're going to get to and from. They're not connected yet to this being a massive, important issue. So working with the Nature Conservancy has allowed us to kind of bring this to a forefront to many, many people, in particular the people in lower income neighborhoods. That they come back now. One of the exciting things is they come back and say, did you see that they're putting this new chemical on streets? How does that radiate heat? They're asking questions that they probably never even thought they would know was a question before. So it's really exciting that we're able to start connecting the learning, connecting the knowledge to where it really needs to be, which is at the grassroots level. Contribution for solutions has to be from an individual all the way up to world leaders. I say that all the time, is that we have to develop individual approaches to everything. And even when we worked with Nature Conservancy, I said, wait a minute, we need to backpedal. We need to connect the dots to what can you do as one person? And I always go back to thinking, when I was walking through that hallway, thinking, okay, I'm not a scientist. I don't really understand all what's happening, but I can see something's happening. What can I do to help this? And that's what we want people to do in the neighborhoods. How can I solve this problem myself? What kind of contribution can I make myself? Everything from, what the materials they buy to build a home. How are they monitoring the materials that are put up in parks? I mean, that sounds silly, but when you're in Arizona and you have a park that has metal in it, you can't even touch these things. So they need to become more aware of their environment, and also housing. So, the through the CDBG funds, the community development block funds, you're able to get rehab dollars to repair your home. But the process, because that's federal money, is so slow. It will take some people sometimes 5 to 6 to 7 months to get that AC up on. And of course, when are they asking for the AC? In April or May. So that is a struggle for us to, one, the money's not enough, obviously, and two, the process is so long. Another thing is some of the details of the process themselves. For example, there was a time, not today, because thank goodness they're addressing it, where they didn't even include mobile homes. If you have any idea how many mobile homes we have in Arizona, but the funds that were through CDBG money would not be able to be invested in mobile homes because they didn't consider them permanent homes. And so now we have been pushing and pushing now that we've learned so much. And the city is now addressing how to help cool those mobile homes and to help replace some of the substandard cooling systems that they have in those homes. So I can't tell you how I feel this is so important. PRC has really taken this on as an aggressive project. And so we're hoping that we can continue to get support. There's so much that has come out of it. And I want to say, our little tiny campaign to not let this get out of people's heads is to put little messages on umbrellas and hand them out at an event. And so that sounds like a little small, but you have to know how big this is for this neighborhood to start reading that stuff and getting connected to the thought. So, and we've been able to connect through a learning partner in our Urban Heat Leadership Academy, the Union of Concerned Scientists, who also were able to tap in for knowledge. When we have a question, sometimes we're looking at a word and we're looking at each other going, what does this word mean? And we actually have some people to connect to. So we're very, very blessed.
And I think one of the things you're talking about is the adaptability, right? How do you address the real vulnerability of people living in mobile homes, and how does policy and implementation change. So that's really interesting and really, I think, essential to address this and recognize and keep learning about where vulnerabilities reside and how to address those. So thanks, Eva, for sharing that. Jad, I guess this is maybe a bit of an unusual question, maybe not. Beyond tree equity, and beyond the power of what urban greening solutions can achieve, I'm thinking here partnerships, and maybe solutions. What are, I guess, the limitations and how to address from an organization like yours, or even thinking, conservation organization like ours, how do we recognize the limitation of nature-based solutions, and how can we either partner up with other organizations or think about addressing the bigger challenge that goes beyond what a tree can achieve, if that made sense?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, because I started out by talking about intersectional solutions. We need multitasking solutions, right? We don't have enough time or money to just kind of try to solve everything in a one-off. So it's a phenomenal question. I'm going to give you a very specific example, but I just got to stop and say, it's organizations like Ava's that are the foundation of this movement. And we can't ever forget, tree equity isn't about trees, it's about people. It's about people. It's about working with people in right communion and partnership at the right time and place. I mean, our organization just published a new community action guide that reflects everything we've learned about what is the right way to sit down at the very beginning, before the decisions are made, not bringing community-based organizations in after the recipe is cooked up. But from the very beginning, create the vision, the goal together, and have a process where by the time we're doing anything, we're doing it together. And I think that's just a foundation for success. And it's attending to things like I talked about, the importance of the economic opportunities. In Detroit, 9 out of 10 people in our workforce crews are formerly incarcerated persons. We're addressing a really significant socioeconomic issue in Detroit as part of addressing this challenge of tree equity. And so we have to recognize this is not just about any one issue. It's about finding intersectional solutions and engaging with people to understand what those diverse needs are and the roles that all these different kinds of people and organizations can play in creating the solutions, which is kind of a perfect segue to what you're talking about. So give a shout out to our friends in Phoenix. Mayor Kate Gallego is a big hero of ours, and Phoenix is first city in the country to commit to tree equity in every neighborhood. Really proud that that's true, and it's been a tremendous partnership of all sorts of organizations there to do that work together. But one thing that Phoenix did was to commit to the creation of cool corridors as part of its tree equity strategy, and mapping out where are there places where active transit needs, walking, biking, bus stops intersect with low tree canopy. And when we were there to plant the first one in the Levine neighborhood, connecting the Chavez High School, park, and library, this super high traffic area. The day before the trees were planted, the students flooded out onto this sun-baked boiling sidewalk. And the next day, there's this giant mile-long corridor of trees connecting all these critically and heavily used public assets, including the bus stop. So that's, I think, what success looks like in terms of transportation leaders, for example, intersecting their work with folks who are working on, the tree piece of the puzzle and really seeing those solutions. And even in that case, also using cool surfaces so that these cool corridors are using every tool in the box, not just trees, to get a cooling effect. And I think when you bring that same mindset to how do we connect heat resilient housing to trees interventions, how do we correct water solutions, as we heard about earlier, we need to be getting folks thinking not just of the problem they're trying to solve, but what are the solutions that can address multiple problems, and then designing this sort of these multi-layered interventions together. And I think Phoenix, Detroit, many other cities are doing a phenomenal job of showing what success looks like in that kind of intersectional approach.
Thanks so much, Jad. I think that, that also touches on the framing question around how the conservation sector can address this challenge. And I think then it's organizations like EVA's, like yours, TNC, other conservation organizations who hopefully help combine through partnerships these different approaches to a solution where then a local, state, subnational, or national government can say, okay, this makes sense. Let's move forward in this way. Paula, so you already preempted that you're going to be talking about solutions, but I'm going to throw a twist here, which is around how these solutions, nature-based solutions, have the potential or not to address then the structural issues. So I know it's not a yes or no answer for sure, but I guess another way to say is where do you see the connection between nature-based approaches to adaptation on one hand and the structural changes that are needed to overcome the three crises that you talked about: climate, biodiversity, equity.
Thank you. Well, I'm looking at the clock and I don't have much time. So I'm going to be very, very brief.
We can go a bit further
Okay.
than that. We have some room.
Oh, okay, good. I was going to talk very fast. So I just want to also do a little bit of level setting because we're talking a lot about access to, for example, AC. In Latin America, people do not have access to AC. And in many places, whether it's in cities and slums or in more remote areas, there's issues about energy access, whether there is or that there is a continuity in the energy access. So we're talking about completely different realities. I don't want to dig too much into that, but I just want to sort of level set that we're talking about different universes. And there's also very high levels of informality in Latin America, which also complicates because you're talking about a lot of not just smallholders, which I mentioned before, but small and medium enterprises that are operating with high levels of informality, which means that their coping strategies, their resilience, their access to credit, their ability to withstand risks and to manage the impacts of climate change are also much reduced. So that's just to level set. But to go back to the nature-based solutions, I was saying before that it's really Latin America is sort of nature's powerhouse. And one of the areas that TNC is working a lot in is regenerative agriculture and ranching. 70% of land use change in Latin America comes from that sector, but it's also hugely important for economies and for our societies. So that transformation, when you talk about structural change, we need to bring about systemic structural change of food and commodity systems across Latin America. And TNC is working very hard on really helping to shift the kind of practices. It can be practices from slash and burn, which we're seeing a 250% increase in wildfire hotspots. Those practices have to change. You have to change how you manage water. You have to change how you manage inputs. But one of the very important areas that we work a lot in within the regenerative agriculture dimensions is on agroforestry. And let me just highlight, because that's another aspect that I want to bring in, that it's not just about structural change to make these systems more resilient and sustainable, but about bringing in indigenous practices. And this is really important because a lot of what we need to be able to manage all these food systems in a better way is already embedded and inserted in the ancestral traditional practices that have been a part of what communities have been working for millennia, and that oftentimes has been lost and has to be rescued. So we talk about agroforestry systems, but the reality is that this is what indigenous and traditional communities have in many cases been practicing for a long time. In the Yucatan and in the Selva Maya, in not very far actually from the border with the US, you have the milpa system. And all of these systems basically are looking at combining food staples with marketable products, with long terms. The bank is timber, for example, timber trees that you plant for timber, which are the long-term investment. So these are systems that are really, that build out short and long-term resistance, because one of my concerns when I was in a climate negotiator, I used to talk about we need adaptation for adults, because it was a lot of very quick fix solutions of dealing with the immediacy of the humanitarian and just the crises that adaptation means for communities. But what we all have to do is think about that long term. And that long-term adaptation is where that structural change comes in. So for us, helping to working with communities, but also with big and medium, all kinds of private sector. And for me, a farmer is private sector. Working with private sector in all of its dimensions to help transform and structurally, through a systems approach, change those food systems, bringing in that traditional knowledge is absolutely critical for the short and long-term resilience and productivity of entire economies, not just communities. But the other piece that I really want to emphasize is that we have to, and it speaks very much to what you were saying, which is basically about translating what this crisis means and why it's relevant to you. How is it actionable? How is it relevant? Those are two questions I ask a lot. And let me talk about what happened in Sao Paulo in 2014, 2015. It was one of the worst droughts in history. It cost them about 1.5 billion reais. And studies have been done that show that if the watersheds that actually supply Sao Paulo's water had been managed with integrated approaches, that means working with the communities, with the productive lands that are part of those watersheds, the economic cost would have been 28% less. But that's not an environmental or an economic issue. It's social, because when those water shortages hit Sao Paulo, they didn't hit them equity. There were water deserts also, if you will. The poorest communities were the ones whose livelihoods were completely disrupted by this drought, much more than wealthier. So there you also have a water inequity, if you will, playing out. And my point there is that you have to translate the fact that these environmental solutions, nature-based solutions, ecosystem services are not environmental. That is where you start to address equity, social, economic issues with a short and a long-term perspective. And we have to change the chip, as we say in Spanish, cambiar el chip, because otherwise we keep seeing the environment and nature-based solutions as an option or something else that you do when they're absolutely germane and at the core of what all of us have to do. And the trees are part of a much bigger equation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Paula, and also for giving that context also on the level setting, on the realities now that we're talking about in the different contexts. So I hope you've enjoyed the conversation as much as I have. I wanted to give the opportunity for people to come in and ask us, ask them rather, any question that you'd like. And then I'll still wrap it up with a 1-minute reflection from each of you, but that's coming. But let me open the floor for any questions or comments meanwhile.
Provocative, insulting, or otherwise are fine.
Complaints, questions, comments.
Does anyone have any stories from the room of things that you all are in this space?
Yeah, let me bring a mic. Hello, hello. Hello.
I can just talk, it's okay.
It's good for the people live
Oh,
streaming, but
Perfect, okay.
yeah, it's
Thumbs up. All right. Hi, I'm Jennifer Tabola, Wetlands International. I have a question with respect to nature-based adaptation, thinking about mangroves in particular, and any examples where you have seen investment in that approach alongside meeting more immediate needs, through traditional gray infrastructure. So, where you're trying to protect in the immediate, time frame, but also be able to come alongside that with longer term, more sustainable, with multi-benefit approaches that use nature as part of that resilience and protection.
I've thought, but if you have one, I'll just mention one that comes to mind in particular is Houston, in the greater Houston area, where there's some huge flooding challenges that I think folks are aware of, and they are significantly tied to the dramatic increase in impervious surfaces in Houston. And so we've partnered with the Houston Galveston Area Council on some intersectional planning of how investments in tree equity can be aligned with investments in more traditional floodwater management structures. And part of it was studying what was the maximum that trees could actually do in remediating these. So we're very clear-eyed about the role of nature-based solutions proportional to this kind of scale of change that we need. And so then using that to align then the investments in other kinds of infrastructure as well. So kind of a gray-green combined approach. But I think that'd be one neat example to take a look at. I'd be happy to share some materials with you afterwards if that'll be of interest.
Great question. With mangroves in Latin America, we're looking at, again, a diversity. There's coastal mangroves, and those are hugely important, not just for the coastal impacts that I think both Catherine and Chair Malawi alluded to, but also because this is about securing livelihoods for all of the coastal communities that rely on the coastal fisheries. So we've been doing a lot of work there, and also working, for example, with shrimp farming in Ecuador to make sure that this is more sustainably managed. So also bringing in bigger production sectors. They are wetlands in Chile. We're doing, for example, a huge amount of work with wetlands. And wetlands are important in Latin America, both in terms of securing water flows and all of the good things that wetlands bring, managing flooding, But there's also very interesting kinds of wetlands in Latin America. For example, we have high mountain ecosystems, which are like high mountain moors, is how in English you could call them, páramos. These very unique ecosystems that exist in 4 countries in the Andes. And these are essentially nature's water factories. They are high mountain ecosystems that provide huge amounts and capture and retain and release huge amounts of water. So they provide the ecosystem as services that they provide are really quite enormous and are starting to be better accounted for. And talking about win-wins, these are also lands that have very, very high carbon content, like the peatlands, for example, in Indonesia. So again, actionable, relevant, getting to understand that this green infrastructure is actually part of any long-term economic and social resilience plan.
Thanks, Jennifer, for the question and for your feedback. And I'll bring the mic. Well, let me give you this mic.
Hi, my name is Laura. Thank you everyone for being here today. This has been a fantastic conversation. So I'm originally from Argentina, so this is also very personal to me, and I have worked in the Nature Conservancy in the past, so I love the mission, and it's great to hear another example of working with an organization like EVAS and doing fantastic work. But my question is, I love what you all said about this is a social issue and not just an environmental issue. And I've seen so many times, especially in Latin America or talking with friends, how it's, oh no, we cannot change these practices because, we have to think about, like you said, having food on the table first and not connecting. So it's usually like a trade-off instead of just being one same thing. So I would love if you can share examples of how you being shifting that narrative, because I think in many cases, it's just changing habits, or what you shared, Paula, about changing water consumption or water sourcing. I think that's really hard sometimes in terms of habits and also socioeconomic practices. Thank you.
Well, I think I understand what you just said. I may not need a scientist to interpret this, but so with regards to including people in the conversation, which is what's happening now, is that part of, okay. So, I would say that fortunately and unfortunately, the government really models how people interact with each other in some ways. And I think that, history has it that people have not felt that government have been good partners at the table, meaning sharing control of the conversation, sharing control of how things are built. And I do think that's changing. And I do think models like the Nature Conservancy are creating that change. It was funny because you had mentioned the social impact of this, not just somebody being mad because it's so hot in there, so they're overwhelmed with the heat. But there is a social impact in that all people have to work together to address this. And it's not a conversation that usually happens in a way that everybody walks into a room and they're equal. And that all the right players are there, that everybody who's involved and needs to contribute to that change is there. And so for us at our level, we see this being a great win for communities across the country to be not only part of the conversation, but that they are creating the solutions themselves, and that together we measure it, and together, we build it, we measure it, and we move on. So
Can I add one? That's so well said. And just a couple things I want to throw into that mix. One is invitation to multitask. I mentioned some data before that we have measured every urban neighborhood in America in a standardized way to understand tree inequities and the impacts that they have, who is impacted and how they are impacted. I invite you to check it out. It's at treeequityscore.org. And we made this as easy to use as a smartphone. You don't need a computer science degree to use it, so that everyone can walk into the conversation, from the mayor to an individual citizen to a community leader, with the same information about what's going on, why are we making the decisions that we're making, are we making the right decisions, and be empowered with data in that conversation. We've heard over and over again in our work with groups like Green Latinos and NAACP and others, that there's this consistent information imbalance in the players around the table, as well as you're noting, financial imbalance, when people are brought in. There are all these different details we have to get right. But really for us, Tree Equity Score, we thought about as democratizing this data so that we could all come to the table with equal power to engage. And so I think that's a part of it. And again, I just have to give a shout out to the way that the Biden-Harris administration and the Forest Service have deployed the first billion of this 1.5 billion for Tree Equity has focused on frontline organizations. It's focused on places where cities like Phoenix and Detroit and others have set up big partnerships where everyone's at the table. And so they've shown that willingness and a commitment to an inclusive approach. And so I think we have a lot of things converging now to help us get right what Ava was just speaking about.
And just to add to that, it's co-creation, and it's enabling people to understand that it is not a zero sum, that on the contrary, the shift is needed if you're going to secure long-term productivity. So for example, with farmers or with ranchers, if they can really understand why regenerative practices, even if they have an upfront investment, and government and financial sector have to help access and change the kind of capital that's available. But if you work with them, which is what we do, to help them understand and translate the benefits for themselves, then the conversation starts to change. Because climate has been unfortunately caught in a very polarized narrative. And this polarized narrative exacerbates this view of this trade-off of the fact that it's environment against, that it's a no agenda. And what we have to translate is to show that this is an agenda for long-term productivity. But we need to be able to change the narrative and bringing the long-term vision, which is a hard thing for human beings. We think in very short cycles, but we all have to be better about understanding the longer-term vision so that we can put in place those long-term adaptation pathways, which is what they've been talking about, short-term solutions, but solutions that create pathways that are long-term, and being able to translate it and to explain that to communities, to mayors, to small and medium enterprises, to large corporations, so that we change the narrative and the mindset about how we think about adaptation.
Thanks so much for your reflection. It's been so interesting and such a nice way to wrap things up. I'll just add that, for me, it's also about partnerships. And just as an example, yesterday we had a meeting at Nature Conservancy with the IFRC, with the International Federation of Red Cross Red Crescent, and we're just really exploring how to boost our existing partnership. I think, that's part of it. We need to engage with these kind of organizations and other organizations who complement the expertise that we have, and well, this is an example of that as well. So I had said before I'll give you a minute, but I'm gonna make it a little bit harder for our panelists here in the last one, and it's not gonna be 1 minute, but more like one sentence. Before I pass it to my colleague Becca to really kind of just share some concluding remarks in the last couple of minutes. But the question before for you, and I'll start with you, Paula, it's the same question, is let's imagine that we were now in 2033 today, and we were having this conversation. So briefly, in a sentence, what will be the biggest difference of having the conversation that we had today, and if we were having that conversation 10 years from now? What do you think might be a, not necessarily concluding remark, but one of the key ideas that you will be bringing to that conversation 10 years from now? And of course, what I'm thinking about here is how would the context and the conditions have changed, the environment have changed, that would lead to that kind of conversation 10 years from now?
I will be celebrating the fact that we had the foresight 10 years before to put in place disruption, transformative solutions, that we stopped just trying to tweak business as usual. And we're going to be talking about how that transformation, how that disruption really changed consumption and production patterns. And we're going to be saying it was so great that we realized that back in 2023, the 2030, 2050 is now. It's not tomorrow. We don't have until. So that's my parting thought. 2050 is now. And in 10 years, if we understand that now, the conversation we're going to have in 10 or 20 years is very different. Otherwise, it's going to be the same conversation.
Chad?
Be rebellious for just a second. I need 20 seconds just to say, I lived through an experience a decade ago where I lived in a home with air conditioning that in a neighborhood that had no trees. My wife was bedridden with a serious injury. I was carrying her around the house and the air conditioner broke. There are a lot of families in America that don't have air conditioning either. It's not just in South America, in Latin America, it's everywhere. And especially in the neighborhoods that don't have trees. And in that moment, I felt it in a different way. And I was already working on these issues, but I felt it. And, I was scrambling literally as the temperature shot up in our house for survival. And it was just, and so that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about the front lines of climate justice. And so for me, it would be a new level of urgency that there is a true equity movement in every city and town in America. And it's propelled by a sense of shared urgency that we all understand that lives are at stake. This isn't scenery. And we're working in an inclusive approach with everyone empowered with the resources and tools they need to be successful. And we are together making true equity happen in America.
Thank you, Chad. Eva?
Thank you. So today they say in 2050, Phoenix will be uninhabitable. They say at that time that temperatures will over 50% of the year will be over 100 degrees. So in 2033, I envision that I'm going to be extraordinarily proud of Phoenix, as I always am, because we would have developed a system that connects the state, the federal, the state, the city, the county, all the cities together to work towards preventing that from happening, and that we will be able to benefit at that time from some of the projects that have been put in place so that we don't see 2050 come and we have to move out of Phoenix or my children. So
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Thank you so much, Eva, Jad, Paula. Please don't go. Stay there for a second because we're going to wrap up the session by, let me invite my colleague, Becca Benner, who is the interim managing director of the Global Tackle Climate Change team in the Nature Conservancy. So Becca, you've been listening to the whole conversation here, and I've offered you the lovely task of trying to share some concluding remarks. What really kind of stuck to you, what you feel is really important for us to keep as a result of this conversation. Can you wrap it up in the last couple of minutes?
Luckily, I speak quickly, but first, a round of applause for all of our esteemed panelists, the first conversation and the second conversation. And thank you, Danielle, for hosting what I think is a really important topic. So I'll just say that I know I'm leaving today with a whole host of conflicting emotions. I sat here listening, and in one moment I'd feel hope for, messages on umbrellas and, saving the paramos in Latin America, the fact that we can actually know how tree equitable different places are and we can do something about it. It's inspiring. It's inspiring that our US government, it has a people forward agenda and is really thinking hard about how do we make things equitable through nature. And then in the next minute, I'm horrified. The statistics you all put out there are just some of the most heart-wrenching things I've heard, the stories you've told, the suffering of the communities that we live in and live near us. So I'm holding both of those, as I imagine all of you are as well. And all I can say is I am excited that we have the solutions. I'm really excited that our US federal government, that nations around the world are recognizing the inequity of the way climate impacts people. And we are starting to find solutions to solve that. And I hope we can go faster. It's going to take all of these people up here. It's going to take all of you in the audience. It's going to take a huge number of people out there. But if we can keep scaling these solutions up and go a lot faster, then we can leave here in 10 years with even more hope than I hope we're leaving here today. That's a lot of hope. So hopefully we're leaving with hope and also holding in our hearts those who are suffering more than we are today. So thank you all, and thank you, Danielle.
Thanks so much, Becca. Thank you. It's the heart and the mind, right? It's the both. So thank you all. Thanks, Becca. Thanks, Chair Brenda Mallory. Thank you, Catherine, who has stepped out. Thank you, Eva, Jad, Paula, for a wonderful conversation, and you for being here. And well, stay tuned. Let's keep working on this.